Thank you everyone for being here for the latest of our GIACE weekly series. This is a series where we ask one of our 14 different research projects to come together and talk to us about their project, their research findings, and some of the insights that they have derived from their work in the last 3 years. Today, I'm really pleased to introduce the PI for a really interesting project, Professor Mark Buntaine, calling us from the University of California in Santa Barbara. He is joined by some partners in his work, Paul Bukuluki from Makerere University in Uganda, and Brigham Daniels from Brigham Young University's Law School. They're going to be discussing their project that looks at whether recognizing individuals for good performance can shift some norms around good governance and eventually lead to reductions in corruption. So before I let these folks take it away, I'm going to quickly run through the GIACE program, its core principles that underpin it, and why we're putting together this series. So the founding principles of GIACE are that research should be problem-focused on anti-corruption, and not just explore the way that corruption can manifest and the damage that it invariably incurs. Projects should be issue-driven and specific, rather than applying a prescriptive, one-size-fits-all solution to corruption, and it should address real-world priorities, incentives, and norms in specific sectors. It should take into account political will, and projects should really focus on reforms that are politically viable. And as is very relevant to this project, it should try and measure the real impact and effects of anti-corruption interventions in a way that engages policymakers and practitioners from nose to tail of the research process. This took on a different shape for every project, but researchers were encouraged to engage partner governments and civil society actors in the research design, implementation, and uptake wherever possible. That's something that this project has done really effectively and has adapted to, given some COVID-19 limitations. So when Mark and the team have finished up their presentation, I'm going to hand things over to Paul, who's going to moderate the following discussion. Please feel free to raise your hand in the Zoom chat or put any questions in the chat. I'll be looking over there. And we want to keep this pretty informal and intimate. So feel free to ask questions. Mark, you can take it away.
Great, thank you, Vero. And thanks to everyone for being here this morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you find yourself in the world. Today, we're going to present the results of a field experiment and linked ethnographic study that is set at Bwindi Impenetrable National Park in Uganda. Bwindi Impenetrable National Park in Uganda runs a revenue sharing program where elected local leaders have to manage development projects that are funded through tourists' gate fees. That program has been problematic for a number of years because of mismanagement and corruption in the program. We implemented a project where we attempted to raise the level of management and decrease the level of corruption in that program by recognizing those local leaders. And we're going to present to you today some evidence about a lack of short-term impacts of that intervention, but some promise for longer-term change of norms if the program were to be continued. So the problem that our project addresses is that in many settings, norms among the public and among officials, whether they be elected or whether they serve in public office, do not support anti-corruption efforts. And this makes trying to address corruption simply through detecting it or punishing it problematic. There's a lot of evidence from research that the long-term experience of corruption, whether that experience is by your coworkers as a public official, or whether that's a member of the public who experiences corruption when dealing with the public sector, results in apathy, powerlessness, and resignation. It can even be socially acceptable in many settings to see public officials use public office to benefit their own social networks. When everyone around you, or most people around you, accept that the use of public office will be done for private gain, there are few people that will come in and attempt to overcome issues of corruption or be principled principles when many people accept these practices as the status quo. And so lots of times when anti-corruption interventions attempt to improve outcomes by increasing the detection of corrupt acts or punishing corrupt acts, it's very difficult to gain traction because there are few actors that are willing to report corrupt acts even when they know about them. And it may not be considered socially beneficial to punish those acts. These problems have been serious in the program that we study. So we study a program, as I said, called revenue sharing that aims to promote conservation and local development near national parks in Uganda. When we did a survey of residents who live near the national park, a majority of them report that corruption is a major problem in the implementation of these projects. And the national park staff have reported to us informally that they estimate up to 80% of the funds historically have been lost to corruption and mismanagement. In the pictures here, you're seeing just a couple of examples of the kinds of development projects that local communities can choose when they are in this program. One is a water supply tank to provide clean water to a village. The other is an unfinished school block that occurred in the program where we study, where the contractor absconded away with the funds that were paid to him to finish this building. And so the community spent a lot of their shared revenue on a school block that was never finished because of perceived corruption between a contractor and a local official. So the approach that we use in this project is to try, instead of detecting these instances of mismanagement and these instances where there's collusion between contractors, between public officials, is to try to recognize the local committees that manage these funds well. A little more background. In the revenue sharing program, the villages elect representatives to a procurement and management committee, and those committees are tasked with overseeing the procurement and implementation of these projects. So they have to select a contractor, they have to evaluate bids, they have to provide ongoing monitoring for the public projects, and crucially, they are supposed to only release funds to contractors when the work is finished. We, in this project, attempt to recognize committee members that fulfill their roles with a great deal of effort and integrity. And how we did that in particular is to offer in advance positive public recognition to these elected leaders when they adhere to guidelines. In this picture, you see our project manager on the ground installing a permanent sign outside of one village that had committee members that adhered to these guidelines and managed their projects with integrity. We also promised local leaders the opportunity to have their names read on local radio and have their villages recognized publicly for excellence in managing these revenue sharing projects. So if they evaluated bids according to guidelines, oversaw project implementation, these committee members knew that they would receive this very public recognition that would be permanent and everyone could see as they pass through their village. As you can see in this sign, they have the names of the committee members that served and that provided the implementation of these projects according to the guidelines. And the goal was, by offering this kind of award in advance, it would motivate local committee members to adhere to these guidelines better. It would also we want to test what is the effect of seeing local leaders that are recognized for good governance and integrity. Does this boost anti-corruption norms and overcome these entrenched problems where there are no principled principles? What we did was a randomized trial linked with an ethnographic study. And here's a brief overview of how the study worked. We provided, in terms of implementation, training to every one of the committees that oversee these public projects. And there are 94 villages surrounding Buntaine National Park. Once the project was up and running, for the committee members that were part of the treatment group, we provided ongoing reminders that they would be recognized if they adhered to all of the project management guidelines. And this happened over approximately 1 year. Every 2 weeks, they would receive voice messages and engagement by the project team to comply with the management guidelines that attempted to prevent corruption. After we had recognized the committee members that achieved excellence, we have a pool of subscribers to a network that feeds out information about national park issues. And we sent half of them a series of voice messages about who had earned recognition and what they had done to earn that recognition before we installed the signs and made the radio announcements. Throughout this process, we collected survey data, we collected ethnographic data to understand whether the prospective offer of recognition changed outcomes, and then did the retrospective chance to learn about leaders who had acted with integrity change norms and behaviors among the public. So I'm going to present the experimental results and then turn it over to my colleague. Unfortunately, our experimental results show that despite the successful implementation of the treatment, we have no evidence that it changed the implementation of projects, nor that it improved or changed norms related to corruption, though there is optimism about long-term effects. This is a summary plot of our experimental results for prospective recognition. So in this plot, we're looking at what are the changes in behaviors or norms among committee members, those who are elected to oversee these projects, if they were part of the group that was offered and regularly reminded about the chance to earn recognition. And the effect sizes are how many standard deviations are they different than the control group of leaders that were not informed about the chance to earn this positive public recognition through signs and radio announcements. We can see that the treated committee members were much more likely to expect to be recognized. So in the top bar, we have strong experimental evidence that the intervention was successful. It raised expectations that they could be recognized. But in terms of estimates of whether those committee members completed more of the management checklist, that is those actions they had to take under law to adhere to guidelines, how long they spent managing projects, whether or not they felt like projects were delivered as planned, whether or not in a behavioral game they played more honestly, whether or not they took more funds away from their community when they had a chance to play a behavioral game to share funds with their community, or on a battery of survey questions that probed their anti-corruption norms on questions like, do you think it's our responsibility to report corruption when we're alerted to it? We do not see any of the leaders have a boost in anti-corruption responses, though they expected to be recognized. Now we said that may not be the whole story. It could be that prospectively offering recognition does not change behaviors or norms, but learning about examples of leaders who act with integrity does. That is, we need, as anti-corruption practitioners, to change the prevailing norms and let people know that there are positive examples out there and that those positive examples can reset what your peers and what the public expect. So as I said, we sent out a series of messages before doing the public recognition to both committee members and residents to tell them about the committee members who had earned positive recognition. Again, we're displaying effects in terms of standard deviations different from the control group. Those committee members who were part of the treatment group, when asked whether or not they had heard about recognition and whether they knew what the other officials who were recognized had done, were much more likely. The intervention was successfully delivered. However, we do not see that it boosts level of honesty, that it boosts the willingness to share a collective set of resources with other residents versus keep them for him or herself, or that boosted anti-corruption norms. Likewise, when we look at residents, so this is now, if you are a normal resident of one of these villages and you get a series of voice calls where you learn about local committees and their members who had earned recognition for acting with integrity and adhering to guidelines. Again, we see extremely strong experimental evidence that the intervention was successfully delivered. People heard about officials who were recognized for acting with integrity. However, this did not change how residents perceived revenue sharing to be more or less effective, their level of honesty in a behavioral game, their willingness to, in another behavioral game, punish leaders who engaged in corrupt acts, or their norms of fighting against corruption. It didn't boost any of these things as expected. So experimentally, we don't see evidence, despite very strong implementation of the treatment, that these interventions change norms. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Paul Bukuluki to talk about the ethnographic evidence that went alongside this experimental result. Paul, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Like Mark mentioned, we had an ethnographic component that was running in addition to the quantitative component. And I have still to say that from the ethnographic component, again, neither eligibility for recognition nor learning about awardees improved the outcomes or changed the norms. And we could see that there was optimism about changes that started to happen, especially in terms of vigilance of community members as a result of learning about the possibility of recognition. For example, in this quote, you see that this time there was limited theft, like when compared to the previous projects. Most people in the previous projects did not get goats, and even when they got them, they were very poor quality. So you see some level of community conscientization and awareness, but it is one thing you not raise awareness and another to shift norms and change behavior. So we see we reached somewhere with awareness due to the program interventions, but that did not necessarily translate into behavior change. Also, we could see some level of vigilance and collective agency of community members happening. Like in this quote, they say we worked very hard in order to get this recognition, and indeed we are happy we got it. For those who got it, a schedule was drawn and designed, and the community members would participate, but mostly remind us to do our role. So we see those things happening. The intervention was achieving a certain level of change, but not necessarily in terms of norms, not in terms of behaviors. Next slide, Mark. And some of the things that we learned moving forward during the rounds of ethnographic interviews was that the committee members who led projects at this level would have been rewarded with something else, like if they were given money as a reward or something tangible. So we could see that most of our means of recognition were symbolic, but some people started to talk about tangible benefits or money. And also they say that I think in addition to the symbolic recognition, individuals should be given tokens. So some kind of aspect around in-kind physical tangible things, in addition to symbolic recognition came in. But we also need to remember that this project was implemented for quite some time under the context of COVID-19, and livelihoods were grossly affected by COVID-19. It could be that that context might have influenced people to think more in terms of tangible things and money because of the ravaged local economies. Next slide. And also, but we could do, amidst all that, it was very interesting to see issues of collective agency coming up. Like, for example, this quote which talks about when the council has interfered, we were very, people were vocal and decided to remove them from leadership positions. So you see that the community was mobilized and they had started to take certain action. So even though the quantitative results don't show a lot of quantitative behavior changes, but we see certain local actions, certain initiatives, certain collective agents here beginning to emerge. It is plausible that maybe if this project had been for a longer time, because it takes time to shift and change norms and behaviors, maybe we would have seen more results. And the next quote, which is, the next quote which talks about, I think it will encourage people to work hard, not only to perform extraordinarily, but also to leave tangible results that anybody can see. So we see that sort of we set the ground, and maybe the next thing was really to begin to see changes, at least in terms of qualitative data. Next. Yeah, and we do have some recommendations. Mark, would you like me to continue with this, so it is Brigham now?
Please do, Paul.
Okay, so in terms of implications and recommendations, we see that recognition should be tied to instrumental concerns of officials and be complementary to structure approaches. So we need to look at the structural issues that Mark went through that operate in this context and address them in addition to the recognition. Also, we think that using recognition as a complementary approach to structural is extremely important. So a combination of interventions that work alongside recognition. We also now think that from what we have learned, that building and reinforcing recognition programs over longer periods of time can heighten expectations for good governance. Because from the qualitative data, even from the quantitative, we see that there was awareness. And in qualitative, we even see some collective agency at the community level beginning to happen, but this needed more time to consolidate those gains. Also linking recognition to instrumental concerns of public officials, because remember, there are issues, drivers of corruption for public officials. They complain of salary, low salary, rotations, promotion, election. So all these need to be taken into account in order to shift norms and behaviors. Next slide. Yeah, and it is important also to combine recognition with social norms transformation approaches that engage community activists or change agents at the government and community level. So local activism, for example, by having community activists and change agents that work at different levels, here we think is extremely important to combine with recognition, and recognition should be considered at multiple levels. At the local government level and at the community level, with the combination of symbolic and tangible benefits. We think that when we do this, we can spur the change that we want to see. Mark, are you taking over here?
You can continue, Paul, or
Okay.
if
Yeah, and then we want also to report that we have ongoing research, which is looking at recognizing procurement officers. So from what we have learned, we also have ongoing research that still is on recognition, but this one is focusing on recognizing procurement officials who are able to engage in a certain set of behaviors that promote more transparency. And I think you see that picture is an interaction between our partner, Transparency International Uganda, and the PPDA, the National Procurement Agency, to train procurement officials from the different districts. So training officers on legal guidelines, for example, for transparency in procurement, and testing whether offering recognition in a national award ceremony for adhering procurement standards will boost compliance to these kind of transparency guidelines in procurement. And we really recognize that we will not be able to experiment these different ideas and lessons without the funding from UK aid, from the British people, from GIASE, which was to support researchers like ourselves to generate world-class evidence on anti-corruption efforts and to go beyond just cross-sectional surveys and studies, but to experiment using RCTs such that we can learn a lot about what is happening and how we can shift norms and behaviors around corruption. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That was a really fascinating presentation. I think it's a really terrific research project, which has elicited a lot of excitement and interest. I'm going to invite people, as I did in the chat, to raise questions, and please do feel free to do so whenever. But can I maybe just kick off with a couple of linked questions that I have about the project. So I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about, you know, the approach to recognition and you know, both prospective and retrospective, but it wasn't entirely clear to me from the way you were talking about it what the recognition was going to be for, because it sounded a little bit in terms of the kinds of things that you were trying to capture, that in a sense you were almost saying, well, if you just do the job as you should do the job, then you will get recognition. But at the same time, you were talking about integrity and demonstrating integrity. And, you know, at one level, I suppose you could say, well, doing the job is behaving with integrity. But at another level, that's a kind of a very minimum standard expectation is, you know, well, if you do the job, then, you know, well, that's what you're employed to do. So would we want to recognize you for just doing the job? Now, it could be, you could argue that in the context of a situation where corruption is very, very widespread, then perhaps that is what is being expected, or that is worthy of recognition. But I wonder whether that would come across to people themselves as, if you're just doing the job, would that be worthy of recognition? So I'd be interested in some comments on, you know, what it is about the role that generates recognition. And then linked to that, the second part of the question is whether, I mean, right at the very end of the presentation, there was some talk about training, but whether in the setting this thing up, whether there was any actual training as to, well, this is what we would expect in regard to, these are the kinds of activities, the kinds of behaviors, the kinds of things which would make you worthy of recognition, as opposed to, you know, this is what the job is, and if you do the job, you will get recognition. So just some thoughts and responses on that would be great. Thank you.
Maybe I can start with that, if that's okay. I also just want to recognize our partner from Transparency International Uganda, Gerald, has gotten into the on the Zoom, and I just wanted to welcome Gerald. He is the key player on our second experiment that Mark mentioned briefly at the end there. So this was a pretty complicated question that you raised, Paul, and we really thought a lot about what we should do. Ultimately, what we decided to do was talk at great length with the national park and basically ask them what is the sorts of things that would not just show that you did the job, but that you did it with great excellence, right? And then second, of those things, which of these things really are designed to tamp down corruption? And we came up with a list of, I think it was 12 different things that we wanted each of the committees to do. And we started actually our interaction the very first time that Paul went out into the field to do ethnographic research. We were also doing trainings of all of the villages, explaining what excellence looks like, and you telling them things that that usually are just told, here is your contractor, and we're telling them, no, there's actually a bidding process. If you don't get the number of bidders, here's what the park recommends that you do. And we basically gave them a whole list of things that we wanted them to do. In addition to this, we asked them to check in with us on a regular basis, and basically to help alert if they had seen corruption, or had they seen, maybe they'd seen excellence. But if there were, some of this is out of their control, the local committees, there's many other players that potentially can raid the funds. And so we wanted them to have sort of regular contact with us. So it was a combination of the checking in and the 12 points that we consider to really show excellence. They were really, it really would have been if a committee had actually done all of the things, it would be similar to how you do procurement in some place like the UK, right? It was just so far beyond what they would normally do. But we tried to train them to basically say, here are simple things you can do if you recognize that this isn't within your reach, and here are alternatives to it. We would constantly message them to try to figure out how to kind of coax them along that path. So a lot of our messages were about exactly how do you do this, and why do you do this, right? So to tamp down corruption is the why, but or to win the reward as well. So anyway, that's my quick take to your question.
And maybe just a slight addendum to that is,
Thanks,
of
Mark.
the 56 joint committees that were trained on all of these tasks, even after the training and the recognition, only 4 of those committee members completed all of the guidelines that they were trained on. And these aren't just guidelines that we are making up as researchers. These are the national guidelines for how you implement and manage revenue sharing. So even after training, only 4 of 56 joint committees completed all of the guidelines.
Yeah, okay.
So doing the job is a heavy lift.
No,
absolutely.
Absolutely. And obviously there are contexts in which just doing the job is incredibly praiseworthy. So, okay, thanks very much for those responses. We've got a couple of questions coming, so I suggest we take them both together, and then perhaps a third if anybody else wants to jump in, and then turn back to Mark and colleagues. So Shiwua first.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. I think this is quite an interesting research that points to core concerns, especially as concerns the resignation of the community members to the fact that they're powerless and they're helpless. However, from your recommendations, there is a point you made, which I wish a little light could be shaded on it so that it can be helpful to some of the works we do somewhere here in Nigeria. And you spoke about recognitions at multiple levels, and specifically that it should be tangible and symbolic. So my concern is, I'm just thinking around my head, what specifically could be tangible rewards that would actually motivate the people on the path of doing things correctly, and at the same time, be able to stop corrupting tendencies. And if possible, if it is going to be the combination of the two, both tangible and symbolic, what could the symbolic rewards look like, and how effective could this be able to turn the tide of odd practices associated with corruption and maybe management of public funds?
Thanks very much for that. Let's take another two questions alongside and then go back to Mark and colleagues. So Cherry Lee and then Friday.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for sharing this research, Mark and team. It's really incredibly useful for us at the Accountability Lab. As you know, we work on integrity icon and have tried this across several countries, this idea of positive deviance. I'm interested in hearing if you surface specific norms and behaviors you were trying to change and how you built that into the messaging you used during the experiment. Because what we found with Integrity Icon now across 12 countries is that that one set of norms or one set of ideas doesn't even translate from one country to the next, or one civil service sector or department to the next, right? So I'm wondering if you were looking at changing specific norms or specific group behaviors, and if you had some sort of like social norms messaging with that, because yeah, that is one thing that I think is really important to tease out. And if we can't speak to the norm specifically, then it becomes not only really hard to measure whether you change the norm, but really hard to see a change in norm, as corruption in and of itself is not a norm.
Brilliant, great question. Friday.
Hey, thanks a lot. I feel very happy because we are all colleagues from Accountability Lab and we're really interested in this topic. And well done on the great research we've on the findings as well. First of all, I think I will also agree on the findings on incentivizing public servants or public officials, as the case may be, because we found that at Accountability Lab as well. That might derail the original plan or the intention for which the project, because people will actually go for the incentives rather than behavior change. Secondly, like Sherry mentioned as well, I think contextually this might be different in different countries across board. But my question would be, what would be the findings there's the slide I saw, I'm not sure I picked it up, but the one that had the messaging on the committee and all of that. What will be the findings from, I'm not sure if it's behavior or, yeah, the behaviors, or what did you identify as a behavioral change communication strategy used in that context? Secondly, I'll be looking at the kind of training, because at Accountability Lab now we are also trying to rethink the strategy of trainings. Trainings in the sense of gathering people in a room and having to teach them or give them some information, and the timeline in which that has been done. How does that work? And lastly, I see one of the slides made mention of structural reform. I will be concerned if that would be like institutional reforms or policy of some sort in that case. Thank you very much.
Okay, back to you, Mark. Plenty good to go out there.
Paul, did you want to kick us off, since many of the questions are about norms, and I can come in after that?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mark. I think it is the interest in norms is really very clear. And of course, the challenges also of shifting norms are also clear, because you need change not only at the individual level, but also at the community level, at the group and community level. And the norms also don't actually just end at the individual, at the community, at the group and community level, but they transcend that because they are also part of the institutional norms. So this is why we are saying that moving forward, I think it is very important to consider shifting specific norms at across levels, because if you change them at one level and you ignore the other levels, you may not achieve as much. But I also wanted to comment about the tangible and intangible rewards. This is basically coming from below. It is coming from our participants who say that given the current context that we were working in, I think yes, symbolic recognition is very important, but this needs to be accompanied by something tangible. An example of what they gave is, for example, if yes, you are recognizing the leaders, but you are also giving a water source to the community that, you know, was able to use collective agency to make sure that their leaders or duty bearers adhere to the guidelines and therefore remain transparent. So that combination, also a combination of, yes, leaders are being recognized, but also the community is gaining something out of that, was emphasized by the community. Whether this is from our own perspectives, correct or not, but that is their reality, that is how they feel from their own experiences. And maybe just to, maybe I will leave Mark and Brigham to first talk about the norms, change intervention strategies that we undertook, and I'll come in later.
Thanks, Paul. Maybe I'll try to touch on some of those points and build them. So first to Shiyiwa question, and apologies if I've gotten the pronunciation wrong. The question about how to combine tangible and symbolic awards. I don't think we have any one-size-fits-all proposal that comes out of this project. And I think that's going to be incredibly context specific. And a lot of the work that we did in combining the experimental and ethnographic studies as part of this engagement was intended to find out what are the ways that symbolic and tangible recognitions could work in this context. And so in this context, we were told that local leaders expected hearing their names on the radio would be hugely important from a social perspective. That was like, if you heard your name on the radio, there's some quote that sticks with me, you know, like, my stomach could still be hungry, but I would be, you know, proud to hear my name on the radio. And there was like that was the currency socially in this setting. Whether that's the currency in another setting, I don't think we have anything to say about that, other than there's got to be a lot of work to figure out what do people value and what has the potential to boost prestige, status, standing within a local community or a community of practice for, let's say, its public officials. And so in this case, we think that maybe it was a issue with implementation during the COVID-19 pandemic. Uganda has had some of the most severe and long-term lockdowns of any country in the world, and that's created major problems. The other thing to mention is that these people are volunteers, essentially. They are elected committee members, but they are volunteering their time and their effort on behalf of the committee. So to serve on the committee on behalf of the community. And so we think that in a more volunteer context, the linking of tangible and symbolic awards could be really important. To Sherry Lee's question about what were the specific norms that we were trying to change, I think there were lots of them. If I had to boil them down to a key thing we were trying to change for at least these elected committee members, was the sense of powerlessness, that this is just how things were done. That when I see something going wrong, or I see one of my fellow committee members, that's not abnormal, that I shouldn't expect anything else. that the norm that when you see problems in the management of public programs, you just disengage because there's no one who's going to back you up in terms of bringing those issues into the public sphere, advocating for yourself as an organization. And so a lot of the training that we did, and this gets to Friday's question a bit also about like what components of the training were we trying to overcome and include when we thought about social norms, is this sense of, yes, as Brigham has said, there were lots of things that were out of these committees' control, but here are the things that you can control. And we should expect as a community that we can make progress in small ways by having a norm that we don't just sit back and accept that these kinds of issues are going to happen in our community and not bring them up with either members of our community or higher levels of government. And so in terms of structural reforms, I think that what we mean there is that essentially this scheme has money passed from a national park to district governments, to sub-county governments, to committees. And so there's lots of chances for different hands to get into the pot. And we don't think that just saying, committee members, if you do your jobs well, but somebody higher up steals all the money, that's going to be enough, because those local committees, though they can bring those actions up, petition sub-county and district governments when problems come up, unless they also overcome the structural problems that the money passes through district and sub-county governments, they can't control what happens up there. They're unlikely to make progress only on changing the norm of sort of like powerlessness and resignation when experiencing these things. Thanks for all of these really great questions, and would love follow up, or I don't know if Brigham has additions.
I do want to just say one thing, well, actually two. The first is, the difference between a symbolic award and a tangible award may be more flexible than we're giving it credit. So one of the things that we're working on in the second experiment that we just alluded to with districts is doing some messaging about this could be helpful to your career. If you get such an award, this, and I imagine, Sherry Lee, I mean, the integrity icon has just got to be helpful to somebody's career. This is just such an enormous award. But for these smaller awards, right, like thinking about like, what is the, if you can show this is a way to show people that an outside group has verified that you did your job and did it well, and that you did the things that were necessary to stop corruption. And so in some ways, right, the symbolic value could just, part of this may just be, and particularly in the bureaucrat setting, not necessarily the volunteer setting, really helping people understand that there may be a connection between you going places and you doing well on corruption. The second thing that I just want to highlight here is, we have thought a lot about the integrity icon model, and the thing that is so interesting about it is, it's the unexpected award that just kind of, after a long career of really doing great, you're now vetted enough to say you really are the real deal. And I do think that there's real big questions about whether that changes norms and how that works, and extremely interesting. This project really does focus, and I just kind of think about highlighting and contrasting what we're doing. We're trying to tell people, if you do all the things, then you get the recognition, right? So holding out the offer of you being able to earn the award, rather than you were recognized for previous work. It's prospectively, we're holding this out, and if you do the following things, you'll get the award. I mean, one of the things about this question that, I think maybe even these two things working in tandem is a really wonderful idea, but we are kind of assuming that a lot of the people that we are dealing with normally would be on the take if they could. Right. And so what we're really trying to do is, and this is one of the reasons I think it is such a challenge, is that a lot of the people that perhaps get themselves involved in these things maybe think that they're going to have some sort of advantage, and we're trying to weave that out. But at any rate, I just thought, since you were here, Sherry, I would just kind of point out just what we're doing and how it differs, and also just congratulations on what you're doing. We're so excited about it.
Thanks very much. Could I just pick up a little bit on that discussion around norms? There's a lot of interest at the moment in the anti-corruption field around social norms, and this is some really fascinating work being led from Tufts around this. But in terms of what you've been describing, it felt to me at times there was almost a slippage from talking about norms, which generally seems to, norms that usually refers to behaviors, what people do, what Bu Rothstein would call sort of standard operating procedure in terms of, if you look at a particular setting, the norms describe what people actually do as opposed to what they say necessarily. But you seem to be talking quite a bit about what people believe, what people think. And, I wonder to what extent you're actually talking about trying to change mindsets as opposed to norms, which are somewhat different things. So it's almost like attitudes and behaviors would be the distinction. So could you just say a little bit more about, what you actually mean by a norm in this context?
Thanks. Maybe I can start and then pass it to my colleagues. I think this is a great question. The way that I conceptualize this, and I think how we design the project, is that there are different kinds of norms, and research on anti-corruption has pointed out that changing different kinds of norms can be important. So on the one hand, you have descriptive norms. That is, what do I think is happening out there in the world? And there's a lot of really good evidence that just learning that my belief about what is normal practice and behavior can change how I behave. So if I'm a committee member and I believe, to use Brigham's language, everyone's on the take, and then I learn that actually, descriptively, there are lots of people who do this job well, maybe I should not assume that stealing the money is descriptively the thing that's happening, and that can change my belief about those descriptive norms. And there are really good evidence that changing descriptive norms can be positive. Then there's proscriptive norms of what ought I do in a given situation, right? Like what are the values that I and other people around me bring into what should be done. And a lot of our messaging in the training was, here are the things that you should do. For example, you need to evaluate and vet bids of at least 3 contractors when you're procuring these projects. You need to call their references. Now, that's something you ought to do, and we did a lot of messaging around why should you do that thing? Well, when you do that thing, that's both fulfilling your responsibilities as a committee member, showing that this is the action that you should be taking, but it also, you should be taking that action because it is pro-social in terms of your community will benefit. So we actually think of the training and the intervention that we pursued as a combination of trying to change descriptive norms and prescriptive norms. In terms of the retrospectively, like learning about those who had achieved recognition, we think a lot of the action is on descriptive norms, like, oh, there are officials that do this job well. Maybe I should pressure my committee member to do this job well also.
Thanks very much. Okay, we've probably got time for one last question. There's one in the chat from David Mafigiri. David, do you want to ask it directly, or shall I just read it out?
Feel free to read it.
Okay, so David says, would you consider that one of the positive outcomes to measure or reflect upon is that the study provides a proof of concept or an opportunity to analyze it as a proof of concept to debate the very complex issue of corruption and how to intervene or respond to it.
Can I start with that one?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that this is, in a lot of ways, I think that this is one of the most interesting, this is the thing that really got us excited about this research project, David, is, you know, we had been doing an experiment where we basically found a government before this work to basically be transparent that wasn't being transparent before. And what we realized when we did that, what a crazy find that was. I mean, just how incredibly lucky we were to stumble on some government that was willing to be more transparent than it was. And that the government then even allowed us to experiment around transparency as they rolled out their new transparency initiatives. It really was kind of a confluence of inability to get the word out because of rough terrain in a lot of ways that made it even possible for us to come into the space. In contrast, when you think about the value of providing an award, I mean, you can go into any context and provide an award. Governments are not skeptical if they say, I want to give you an award if you do a good job, right? It is an easier ask. It's an easier thing for civil society to be able to grasp on. It is just, I mean, obviously there's going to be a lot of variation, and then there's great questions about whether or not it works and to what extent. But this question about, you know, we do think that trying to prove out this concept and improve the concept has a lot of value, because in the event that awards can do some of the lifting, you could imagine that an intervention like this could really change how things worked. So that's my take on your question, but I love the question. It's one that's really gotten me interested. It's just, I feel like this is low-hanging fruit if it works.
Thanks very much, Brigham. Well, we're just about at time, so it really just remains for me to say thank you very much to Mark, to Paul, to Brigham for such a fascinating presentation, and to everybody else for your engagement and some really interesting questions. So thank you very much. Do please keep an eye out for future events in this series. There are still a few to go, which you can find. I think the link was posted in the chat, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
And please do get in touch if you have further comments or questions.